It's Monday morning, just 3 days before Thanksgiving, and, usually this is the week I spend reflecting on how far we've come. I vividly remember sitting at the dinner table in the 1950s Jim Crow South. Back then, thankfulness. It wasn't about abundance, it was really a survival tactic. We were giving thanks just for the bare necessities, for the safety of our family in a world of, well, legalized segregation. But this year, that familiar warmth has been replaced by this cold, nagging contradiction. You see, I spent my career as a communications engineer, a senior technology executive. I helped build the modern world of instant connectivity and information. Yet when I look around at this new normal, at family members just glued to their glowing screens, at the tribalism tearing through our political discourse, I don't feel the pride of an architect. I feel a grave concern. It is such a jarring irony. I lived through an era where the system literally forced us apart, only to now watch us use these miraculous technological advancements to voluntarily segregate ourselves all over again. We've traded the harsh realities of the past for a present defined by public gaslighting, obsessive digital distractions, and a social fabric that feels like it's being ripped at the seams. So why does this Thanksgiving feel less like a celebration of progress and more like a warning sign? And how did the very tools we thought would save us end up becoming the biggest threat to our democracy?
That's a profound question. And it just captures the central paradox of our time perfectly, doesn't it? We've achieved this unprecedented technological progress, instant global connectivity, but at the same time, social fragmentation is at an all-time high, and it often shows up as this intense political tribalization. So our mission in this deep dive is to really investigate the structural and the psychological roots of this modern paradox. We have extensive research here, articles, sociological studies, political science data that cuts directly through the anecdotal noise. It shows how digital technology, polarization, and the health of our civic institutions are just. They're profoundly intertwined. We're not just going to report findings, we're going to explore the mechanisms behind them. We'll break this down into three core areas. First, we will define precisely what modern polarization looks like in the U.S. and its immediate relationship to democratic stability. Then we'll spend a significant amount of time examining the role of digital technology, particularly social media, in eroding social capital and civic competence. We'll be addressing those unintended societal consequences you, our listener, are probably feeling every single day. And finally, we'll move toward identifying some tangible pathways to rebuild connection through critical inquiry, psychological interventions, and shared civic goals. We're looking for the practical levers, the things that can actually strengthen democratic resilience in this current era of disruption and fragmentation.
Okay, let's unpack this polarization issue first, because the common perception is that everyone is simply becoming more radical on policy, just more extreme. But the research draws a crucial and I think a really counterintuitive distinction between two forms of mass polarization that fundamentally changes how we see the problem.
Exactly. This distinction is the academic key to understanding why our system feels so broken.
Right.
We distinguish between, first, ideological divergence, and second, partisan sorting. So ideological divergence is the scenario where disagreement about policies increases across the board. Your policy views drift apart to the extremes, so you get more extreme liberals and more extreme conservatives in the general population.
And the common wisdom, especially if you watch cable news, is that this extreme divergence is what's driving all the conflict. But the data tells a much more complicated story, right?
It really does. That is the critical empirical finding. It comes from these long-term data sets like the General Social Survey and the American National Election Studies. And what they show is that while political elites, Congress members, high-level donors, party organizers, they are undeniably suffering from extreme ideological divergence. Large-scale ideological divergence among the mass public has not increased all that significantly. Most Americans are still clustered right around the center on many core policy questions. They are not individually radical policy extremists.
That's a monumental point. I mean, if the average voter isn't drastically diverging on policy, why does it feel like we're living in two separate, mutually hostile countries?
And that brings us to the real driver at the mass level, partisan sorting. This is the process where a person's party identity, Democrat or Republican, becomes perfectly aligned with their ideological position, their cultural identity, their views on every single emerging issue, regardless of their actual policy nuance. It's the crystallization of interests.
So what you're saying is, if I know your party, I can basically predict everything else about you. Where you live, where you shop, what news you consume, what you think about climate change.
Precisely. Partisan sorting acts as this single powerful heuristic. It takes all these multiple lines of potential conflict, be it race, religion, regional identity, specific policy views on healthcare, and it organizes them all neatly under one of two mutually exclusive party banners. The result is that Democrat and Republican have become nearly perfect synonyms for liberal and conservative, respectively, across almost all issues. This sorting has increased dramatically over the last few decades, and it's created these exclusive separate factions where party membership is a profound reflection of personal identity. It's not just what you believe that changed, it's how neatly those beliefs now fit together under a single, often toxic label.
That sounds so much more toxic than simple disagreement, because if I don't see you as just a policy opponent, but as a representative of an entirely different cultural group that opposes everything I stand for, I mean, that sounds like a recipe for intense hostility.
It is. And this toxicity is captured by a third, distinct, and highly corrosive form of division, affective polarization. Affective polarization is purely the emotional dimension. It refers to the powerful, visceral dislike, the moral contempt, and the deep distrust of the political outgroup. And that leads to intense personal hostility and, of course, a decreased willingness to compromise.
We really need to put a fine point on how real this hostility is. It's not just people shouting at each other online, is it? It bleeds into actual life choices?
Oh, absolutely. The research paints a really stark picture of social separation driven by this affective polarization. We see statistics showing that significant percentages of Americans would be unwilling to date or to hire or even live next door to someone from the opposing political party. We are talking about genuine social distance. This psychological barrier is what transforms policy disagreement, which is actually healthy for a democracy, into personal enmity, where groups start to question the moral legitimacy of the opposition. They see the other camp not just as wrong, but as an existential threat to their way of life, or even to the nation itself. This emotional distancing is the key driver of that feeling of fragmentation you described in your opening.
Wow. And when that level of affective polarization is embedded in the system, it raises serious questions about the fundamental functionality and, I guess, the durability of the democracy itself. Let's move to the metrics that political scientists use to measure democratic stability, specifically looking at the VDEM Liberal Democracy Index.
The Varieties of Democracy Project, or VDEM, is crucial because it doesn't view democracy as just a binary state. Either you are one or you aren't. It sees it as a continuum, evaluating systems across core dimensions like the robustness of checks and balances, the strength of civil liberties, and the freedom and fairness of elections.
And what does this rigorous measurement tell us about the United States?
It shows a concerning downward trajectory. The U.S. liberal democracy score has seen a slight but persistent dip over the last decade. It fell from a relatively high 0.85 in 2015 to 0.77 in 2023. Now, that might seem like a small decimal shift, but in the context of global democracy tracking, these kinds of declines are significant. They often precede much sharper drops if the underlying causes aren't addressed.
What specifically do the VDEM experts cite as the major sources of this decline in the U.S. score?
The decline is linked directly to expert survey responses, and they highlight three main areas. First, perceptions of violence or the threat of violence around the time of elections. Second, concerns that opposition parties can't exercise effective oversight over the ruling party, which suggests weakened accountability. And third, evidence of weakened checks and balances. We can connect these abstract points to real-world political actions. Prolonged government shutdowns used as leverage, partisan efforts to redefine voter eligibility, or blockades of judicial or executive branch nominees that prevent the government from effectively fulfilling its mandate.
And if we want to identify the fundamentally absolute non-negotiable test of democratic health, we should look to the work of political scientist Adam Przeworski.
Right. Przeworski's test is deceptively simple and just profoundly important. Democracy exists when an incumbent government peacefully cedes power following a loss at the polls. That's it. It requires that the losers accept the legitimacy of the winner and continue to participate in the political process. This agreement to abide by the results, even when you lose, is the bedrock of democratic stability.
And how did the events of 2021 impact this bedrock?
The events of January 6, 2021 directly violated this core tenet. We saw an effort, supported by segments of political elites, to subvert the established democratic process and halt the certification of a legitimate election outcome. For political scientists, this was a flashing red light, a huge one. You simply cannot maintain a functioning democracy if the losers are unwilling to accept the outcome and allow the winner to govern. This transition isn't automatic. It's a norm that must be actively reinforced by all participants.
Further emphasizing the gravity of this moment is the framework provided by political scientists Medler and Lieberman. They identify not just one, but 4 critical destabilizing factors that are currently threatening the system.
The 4 threats framework. It highlights the simultaneous pressure points on the system. They are 1. political polarization, which we've been talking about. 2, conflict over who belongs, which is rooted in racial, ethnic, and cultural tensions. 3, extreme economic inequality. And 4, executive aggrandizement, the overreach of presidential power.
And the sources really stress that the danger isn't that we are facing any one of these problems, because we've had them before. We've had periods of extreme polarization. We've certainly seen executive overreach during the Nixon era.
Correct. Historically, the U.S. has navigated these threats individually. But the truly dangerous moment, according to Mettler and Lieberman, comes when they converge. They argue that the convergence of all 4 factors, high polarization combined with deep inequality, heightened conflict over group identity, and instances of executive overreach, is basically unprecedented in modern U.S. history. This convergence makes the current threat particularly acute, and it demands serious, sustained civic vigilance and critical inquiry to address the complex interplay of these systemic drivers.
This intense analysis of polarization brings us directly back to that original tension. How the technological infrastructure I, as a communications engineer, helped build has somehow exacerbated these structural weaknesses. We created the tools for instant connection, yet we are more disconnected than ever.
That tension is the core theme of this next section. The sources highlight that the proliferation of mobile devices and the resulting phenomenon, the constant demand for our attention, the poverty of attention, is directly linked to the decline of social capital and a significant rise in social isolation. This aligns perfectly with classic sociological findings, notably from Robert Putnam, showing a withdrawal from communal life.
And we are withdrawing not just from communal life generally, but from specific civic functions that used to bridge divides.
Absolutely. Think about the tangible decline of civic group participation. Participation in traditional civic organizations like the PTA, local clubs, unions, fraternal organizations. It has plummeted over the last 50 years. These were the crucibles where people from different political, economic, and racial backgrounds learned to compromise and work together on shared, non-political goals. That's the essence of bridging social capital. And as these organizations wither, the vacuum is often filled by digital communities that are ideologically homogenous.
And the resulting isolation is ironically paired with increased segregation. Despite the nation becoming more demographically diverse, we are physically separating ourselves.
That's the tragic irony, isn't it? We are separating on multiple dimensions. Neighborhoods persist in racial segregation. Income-based segregation has grown significantly, and critically, counties across the country have become more politically homogenous. The data shows that nearly half of Democrats and Republicans report having few or even no friends from the opposing party. This creates a situation where opinions are influenced more by these abstract, often antagonistic media narratives and algorithms than by shared, nuanced, lived experience with diverse neighbors.
So technology fosters the isolation, and that isolation fuels fear and effective polarization because the other side is no longer a person you carpool with, but a caricature that's amplified by an algorithm.
That's precisely the erosion mechanism. We lose the ability to see the other side as fully human. But let's get specific about social media, which is often blamed for creating these ideological echo chambers, this idea of cyber balkanization.
Right. The initial hypothesis was that the internet would allow us to perfectly insulate ourselves, creating these enclave deliberations where like-minded individuals only reinforce their own extreme views.
That was the expectation. And while those enclaves certainly exist, and sometimes they serve positive functions like safe spaces for marginalized groups, and other times they foster extremism, the research offers a fascinating, really counterintuitive finding that significantly complicates the echo chamber theory.
And what does the research show about our actual exposure?
Social media often increases an individual's exposure to diverse political ideas, sometimes even more so than traditional curated news consumption. This happens because social media forces us to maintain contact with what sociologists call weak ties, acquaintances, coworkers, high school classmates, distant relatives. These people are inherently less ideologically similar than our intimate, strong ties. You may hate your uncle's political posts, but you still see them. And these weak ties are key vectors for novel, cross-cutting information.
Wait a second. If people are seeing diverse views, why doesn't that lead to moderation? Isn't the point of seeing the other side to build empathy and understanding?
Logically, yes, that should be the outcome. But here's the critical distinction that explains the paradox of digital division. It's not the exposure that polarizes, it's the context and the reaction to that exposure. Studies show that this increased cross-cutting exposure, especially when it's presented in an uncivil, challenging, or derogatory context, which is often optimized for engagement online, can trigger a backlash effect, or what we call motivated reasoning.
Motivated reasoning. That means I use my intellect not to seek truth, but to justify my pre-existing beliefs, right?
Exactly. When self-identified partisans are exposed to messages that are counter to their views, particularly when those messages come from elites or are delivered in an overtly hostile tone that criticizes their identity, they experience cognitive dissonance and a sense of threat. So instead of changing their mind, they deploy motivated reasoning to defend their identity, and they become more extreme, not less. For example, some studies found that Republicans exposed to cross-cutting partisan messages online became significantly more conservative in response to what they perceived as an attack.
That is the truly terrifying irony. The infrastructure I helped design to share information and bridge distances is now being used to weaponize those weak ties, amplifying hostility because the algorithms prioritize inflammatory content that elicits this very backlash effect. The uncivil tone turns potential moderation into a deepening of effective polarization.
And compounding this issue of digital fragmentation and weaponized incivility is a shocking crisis in foundational knowledge. The lack of civic literacy across the American population. And this isn't just about failing a history test, it's about lacking the functional tools needed for informed self-governance.
So the data on this front is genuinely alarming. I mean, truly.
It is a 5-alarm fire drill for civic health. Over 70% of registered voters consistently fail a basic civic literacy quiz. And we're not talking about obscure constitutional amendments. We are talking about questions as fundamental as naming the 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial, or knowing the number of years in a senator's term.
What worries me is the gap between aspiration and reality. Americans know civic knowledge is vital. 95% say understanding government is crucial for national success, but only 46% believe the U.S. population is performing well in this regard.
This deficiency in basic knowledge severely compromises our ability to translate civic values into informed, effective citizenship. If you don't understand the mechanisms of checks and balances, you can't properly identify when those mechanisms are being subverted. This lack of foundational understanding makes the public highly susceptible to public gaslighting, to the spread of easily digestible, polarized narratives and misinformation, which further weakens the norms of critical inquiry necessary for a democracy to function.
So, if the government and the media are increasingly contributing to the problem, the research identifies one surprising area of our social fabric that is still relatively intact: the workplace.
It's a crucial insight and a potential point of leverage. While 75% of Americans view political division nationally as a major problem, only 19% report seeing significant political tension at work. The workplace, surprisingly, stands out as a kind of sanctuary where Americans are still forced to connect across ideological, racial, and socioeconomic differences under the umbrella of shared non-political goals. A project, a quarterly report, hitting a sales target.
This suggests that businesses have a unique, maybe an inadvertent mandate to step into this civic breach.
They absolutely do. Public trust in Congress, the media, organized religion, it has plummeted. But trust in businesses, both large and small, remains relatively high. Over 80% of Americans hold positive views of the business community, and 82% agree that businesses can play an important role in bringing people together and fostering constructive civic participation. Since the traditional social fabric is so strained, the business community is increasingly seen as a vital thread that can knit us back together, offering structure where formal government and media are currently failing.
Okay, we often hear the narrative that this crisis of polarization is being driven by young, hyper-online radicalized generations. To truly assess who is driving these trends, we need to apply the rigorous academic tools that disentangle the influences of time.
That's where the age period cohort, or APC framework, comes in. It helps us determine if a change in political behavior is due to one of 3 things. 1, age effects, which is how an individual changes as they grow older. 2, period effects, societal changes like 9/11 or the rise of social media, which affect everyone equally. Or 3, cohort effects, the unique political experiences that permanently shape a generation, like boomers experiencing Vietnam or millennials experiencing the Great Recession.
And when we run the data, what does the APC framework reveal as the dominant driver of polarization?
The data is definitive. Period effects are the most significant factor driving the overall polarization trends, which aligns with the lifelong openness model. This means the political environment, the increasingly polarized elite rhetoric, the changing media landscape, the emergence of cultural wedge issues is exerting a powerful, polarizing influence on everyone, regardless of when they were born. The system is getting more polarized, and it's pulling all age groups along with it.
But the research yields a genuinely surprising finding when we isolate the generational component, one that directly challenges that narrative of the radical, young online firebrands.
Yes, it's a crucial finding that provides some tentative hope. Contrary to popular expectation, baby boomers are generally shown to be the most polarized cohort, both in terms of partisan sorting and, notably, ideological divergence. The newer generations, Gen X and millennials, tend to be less polarized.
Wait, I need to pause there. Are you saying that the generation that grew up before social media and before this peak era of effective hostility is actually the most deeply entrenched in partisan belief?
That's what the evidence suggests. It implies that generational replacement, as older, more polarized cohorts exit the political stage and are replaced by Gen X and millennials, is likely to dampen the overall rise in mass polarization, not fuel it. This is partly because newer generations often hold more culturally liberal outlooks, which makes them slightly less susceptible to the specific conservative sorting mechanism that dominated the late 20th century.
That reframes the entire timeline of the polarization surge. It seems the surge reached its peak intensity when the baby boomers became the dominant political cohort in the 1990s and 2000s.
The data on partisan sorting backs this up powerfully. The surge isn't subtle. It's a dramatic structural shift driven by these period effects. Partisan sorting on ideological self-placement jumped from 0.25 in 1974 to a staggering 0.78 in 2021. This alignment across all demographic and ideological lines has accelerated immensely, particularly on what are called emerging issues.
Can you elaborate on that? How did these emerging issues become so neatly sorted?
Sure. Take cultural policies and immigration, for example. These issues were not strongly linked to party identity in the 1970s and 80s. Sorting on immigration was negligible until around 2008. But once these issues were nationalized and politicized by party elites, the sorting accelerated at an incredible pace, aligning perfectly with party identity. By 2020, sorting on these emerging cultural issues reached 0.49. This just demonstrates the power of the period effect, the national political environment, to categorize and align attitudes across the entire population, regardless of age.
Now let's look at age effects specifically. How does individual political learning and partisan alignment change as we move through our lifespan?
The research on political learning shows that the critical periods for solidifying political identity and aligning party preferences with issue positions, which strengthens partisan sorting, occurs predominantly during the formative years, specifically between ages 17 and 30. After the age of 30, that relationship tends to stabilize.
So older citizens are often more constrained and locked in by their partisan identities on long-standing issues because they develop those identities before they turn 30.
That's the mechanism, yes.
Yeah.
They solidified their partisan filter during a key learning phase. Their worldview is constrained by that partisan lens more than younger people, who may still be actively sorting through their beliefs.
Okay, finally, let's address that classic stereotype. The radical youth, who eventually matures and becomes more nuanced and moderate with age. Does the data support the idea that political maturation automatically leads to nuance?
Unfortunately, no. The idea that aging automatically brings moderation is largely contested by these findings. If anything, the effects are minor, and the trend suggests that individuals adopt slightly more radical political viewpoints as they grow older, up until their late 20s. This isn't necessarily a shift to outright extremism, but rather the intensification of attitudes developed during their formative years, or simply the process of political learning moving them from a neutral, uncommitted position to one side of the ideological spectrum. The crucial takeaway remains. Maturity does not automatically guarantee nuance, and we cannot simply wait for the population to age out of polarization.
So we've established the underlying problem is not necessarily deep ideological disagreement, but this high effective polarization, that emotional hostility driven by systemic forces. The encouraging news that underlies all this heavy data is that Americans genuinely want to move beyond the hostility. There is a deep, unmet demand for connection.
That is the essential insight and the critical foundation for any solution. There is a strong public mandate for bridging. 7 in 10 Americans, or 70%, feel a connective responsibility. That means they believe they have a moral or civic obligation to engage with people whose backgrounds and viewpoints are different from their own. And crucially, they express high interest in active bridging activities.
What specifically are they interested in doing? I'm assuming it's not just arguing in a comment section.
Definitely not arguing. They are most interested in activities involving shared action and collective purpose. About 74% are interested in working to achieve a mutual goal that improves their community. This strongly suggests that people prefer non-confrontational, action-oriented settings that produce tangible, positive cross-group outcomes, rather than simply sitting down to discuss their differences. We want to do things together, not just talk about our differences.
Yet despite this high demand and this connective responsibility, connection isn't happening frequently enough. This points to the powerful barriers of emotional temperature and apprehension, especially when it comes to political bridging.
Right. Compared to bridging across race, religion, or socioeconomic status, political differences are viewed as distinctly more uncomfortable, more volatile, and therefore less energetically pursued. The specific barriers cited by Americans highlight that effective polarization is translating into real, paralyzing fear.
Let's detail those barriers. What are people afraid of?
They cited four main fears. Fear of discomfort, that was 17%. Being misunderstood, also 17%. Lacking the energy to engage, that was 18%. And even concerns for personal safety at 13%. And these fears are completely rational given the toxic, uncivil rhetoric that dominates our national discourse. The perception is that engaging politically is high risk, low reward.
So if that apprehension, that high-risk perception is the wall preventing connection, how do we dismantle it? What are the conditions that make people willing to take that risk?
The conditions are extremely insightful because they focus on authenticity, purpose, and respect, not incentives. The most frequently selected condition was if we had a common goal we were working towards. This just reinforces the idea that shared action precedes successful connection. Following close behind were if I were confident we had something in common, and crucially, if I knew they had respect for me. People need to believe the interaction will be grounded in mutual respect, not mockery or judgment.
It's interesting that the research explicitly notes that financial incentives were rarely selected. This isn't a transactional problem, it's a psychological one.
Precisely. The research stresses that the core drivers are less about who you are demographically, your income, age, or education, and far more about what you believe and how you feel. It's the power of psychological predictors that determine your willingness to engage.
So let's identify the strongest positive factors that predict this interest in bridging.
The single strongest positive predictor is perceived community norms. This means the belief that connection across difference is common, practiced, and valued in your local community is the most powerful determinant of whether an individual will engage. If you think connection is valued, you'll do it. Other strong positive factors include social curiosity and a strong sense of connective responsibility. This shows the environment really matters more than individual characteristics.
And what's the single biggest emotional hurdle we have to overcome?
The strongest negative predictor is intergroup anxiety. The fear of having an awkward, uncomfortable, or potentially hostile interaction with someone from a different group. High anxiety dramatically reduces willingness to engage. We must focus intensely on reducing this apprehension. So the primary enemy in bridging the political divide isn't ideology, it's anxiety. It's the fear of starting a conversation that ends badly.
And given that anxiety is the barrier, and we're talking specifically about political divides, what psychological trait is uniquely critical for crossing that political aisle?
For political connection specifically, the key unique predictor is intellectual humility. People who score higher on measures of intellectual humility, the willingness to acknowledge the potential limits of one's own certainty and to question one's own beliefs, are significantly more open to engaging with others who hold different political views. This highlights that political bridging requires a specific cognitive disposition, a willingness to potentially be wrong, or at least to realize your opponent might have a valid point.
This concept of fostering positive community norms and reducing anxiety leads us directly to the idea of connection cascades, those virtuous cycles where a positive cross-group interaction increases the likelihood and willingness for future engagement. If psychological factors are so important, we should look to local environments to see how they successfully foster these cascades.
Indeed. We have to move past the national media narrative and examine local environments. The norms, events, local economy, and history of a metropolitan statistical area, or MSA, play a massive role in shaping both the willingness and ability to connect. We can see this in the detailed profiles of Pittsburgh, Kansas City, and Houston.
Let's start with Pittsburgh, which presents a fascinating tension between internal trust and external separation, what the research calls strong bonding but weak bridging.
Pittsburgh MSA residents have remarkably strong feelings of local community trust and safety. 75% agree that most people in their community can be trusted. They live in these close-knit, highly bonded neighborhoods. However, this strong internal bonding comes at the cost of external bridging. They exhibit lower than average interest in connecting across political differences, and they report highly homogeneous friend groups, both racially and politically. This reflects the region's historical and ongoing challenges with racial and economic segregation. They trust their immediate circle, but they don't trust the broader, diverse metropolitan area as much.
So how do Pittsburghers manage to bridge those gaps, even marginally, when they are so comfortable in their segregated bonds?
The unifying forces are often non-political shared identities. Focus group participants frequently cited local sports teams, the Steelers, the Pirates, the Penguins, as providing crucial, safe opportunities to put aside political and socioeconomic differences for a common, unifying civic identity. And hyper-local community events like the annual Picklesburg Festival, which draws hundreds of thousands of people from all backgrounds to the city's riverfront, were cited as critical to forming those casual, low-stakes connections that overcome the usual political divides. They find ways to connect through a shared identity outside of politics.
Moving west to Kansas City, the community profile suggests an inherently different civic mindset, one more actively oriented toward engagement.
Kansas City MSA residents report an exceptionally strong sense of connective responsibility, about 78%, and high community trust. And crucially, they report frequent, active interactions across racial, religious, and political lines, often exceeding national averages. They appear to have a deeply embedded, community-oriented mindset that prioritizes social cohesion.
And what are the local drivers of this high level of bridging?
Well, local community events, music festivals, and a shared, intense fandom around their sports teams like the Chiefs help reinforce positive community norms. The success of a local initiative like the Likens Neighborhood Association provides a concrete example of resilience. This association revitalized blighted properties by making diverse community engagement central to its decision-making process. They actively sought input from longtime residents and new arrivals, which led directly to reduced crime, increased property values, and robust civic involvement. It's a case study in how intentional, shared action drives both civic and economic renewal.
But the Kansas City profile shows they struggle in one specific area, even with that high general engagement.
They do. Despite high interest in connecting generally, engagement across socioeconomic lines lags slightly behind. This indicates that while the community is energized about bridging racial, religious, and political divides, structural barriers related to economic inequality or residential sorting still present persistent challenges to full socioeconomic integration.
Finally, let's look at Houston, which seems to exemplify the success of a culture built on genuine, sustained, cross-group connection.
Houston MSA residents stand out with a strikingly positive outlook and significantly higher interest in connection across all lines of difference: race, religion, SES, and politics. They report higher than average levels of cross-group interaction and more positive overall attitudes toward community integration. The foundation for this success lies in the region's long-standing massive demographic diversity. Houston is one of the most racially and ethnically diverse areas in the U.S.
But as we know, diversity alone is not a guarantee of connection. It requires infrastructure and programming to facilitate interaction and reduce that anxiety.
That's where Houston provides the perfect scalable example of shared action. We have to talk about the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo. This is not just a 2-week event, it's a massive year-round civic enterprise. It relies on 35,000 diverse volunteers who work toward the common, deeply shared goal of supporting Texas youth and education.
Describe the depth of this commitment. What makes this a connection cascade generator?
The sheer scale is astounding. Volunteers serve on committees that work all year, covering everything from fundraising to organizing the livestock auctions. They come from every demographic slice of the Houston area, different races, income levels, and crucially, different political affiliations. And because their focus is entirely on a non-political, universally valued, goal-raising scholarship money for kids, they're forced into deep, sustained collaboration. This shared humanity and common purpose creates lasting, genuine bonds that transcend the political sorting that divides the rest of the nation. It transforms strangers into teammates and reinforces strong, positive community norms, fostering these large-scale connection cascades.
So if we synthesize the findings from these local environments and the psychological research, what are the actionable interventions we can take to reduce intergroup anxiety and replicate these connection cascades?
The path forward is pretty clear. First, we must focus on creating meaningful opportunities centered on shared goals activities, not debates. Second, we have to actively correct the widespread misperception that the other side doesn't want to connect. The data clearly shows they do. And third, we must intentionally reduce intergroup anxiety through carefully structured interactions.
And the research highlights a fantastic practical model for this.
Yes. The prime example is StoryCorps' One Small Step initiative. This program pairs political strangers, not with the goal of solving policy debates, but merely to sit down and share personal stories focused on shared humanity. The format is designed to be low stakes, high empathy, and the findings are remarkable. Research demonstrated that simply listening to a recording of a One Small Step conversation can increase the number of Americans interested in taking part in similar cross-divide conversations by almost 50%. Just sharing the narrative of a successful anxiety-free connection is itself a powerful intervention that helps people overcome their hesitancy and that paralyzing fear of engaging.
So if we synthesize everything we've covered, the core contradiction is clear. I helped build the technological infrastructure for instant connection, yet we face democratic instability fueled by effective polarization. The data shows this polarization is less about deep, irreconcilable ideological divides among the public. Those individuals aren't that extreme, and far more about the anxiety and hostility derived from a lack of meaningful, unthreatening contact and the failure to recognize a shared purpose.
And we've established that the intense period effects are the primary drivers of this, affecting all generations through pervasive partisan sorting, while digital technologies amplify division through that backlash effect to uncivil, cross-cutting exposure. The sources are clear. The path forward relies not on waiting for political elites to fix the problem, but on creating intentional opportunities for bridging at the local level. The primary battleground is moving from Washington, D.C. to our neighborhoods, our workplaces, and our community events.
The ultimate insight of this deep dive is that repairing our fragile social fabric requires intentional civic commitment. The responsibility for paying more attention and fostering genuine connection shifts from distant technological architects or political elites to local citizens and institutions. We must focus on intentionally creating the shared goals, the common identity, and the community norms necessary to strengthen democratic resilience. We must deliberately invest in opportunities to turn our widespread yearning for connection into connection cascades, proving that the principle of a pluribus, one out of many, one is still actionable today, one shared goal and one non-anxious conversation at a time.